Nintendo's cartridges. Nintendo's choice to stick with cartridges for the Nintendo 64 is often remembered as the single worst feature. While the reasoning made sense in 1996, cartridges offered faster loading times, they were more durable, and made piracy harder, the trade-offs were brutal. A typical N64 cartridge held only 8 to 32 megabytes of data. Compare that to the 650 megabytes a standard PlayStation CD could hold, and you can see the scale of the problem. Developers had to slash cutscenes, compress textures until they were blurry, and even alter music to fit inside the tiny storage space. That's why ports like Resident Evil 2 looked and sounded dramatically downgraded on the N64 compared to their PlayStation versions. I owned Spider-Man for the N64 and never realized that game even had cutscenes until I went to a friend's house who had the PS1 version. The limitation also scared away big third-party developers. Squaresoft had pushed Nintendo to adopt CDs, but when Nintendo refused, Final Fantasy VII moved to the PlayStation instead. That single decision reshaped the entire console war. To patch the gap, Nintendo introduced the 64DD add-on, a disk drive meant to expand storage, but it only released in Japan, sold poorly, and vanished almost instantly. In hindsight, cartridges gave Nintendo an image of stubbornness. And while the system's first-party games still became legends, games like Super Mario 64, Majora's Mask, and Star Fox 64, the format crippled its broader library. A design meant to protect quality ended up costing Nintendo dominance. Cell split. Sony wanted the PlayStation 3 to feel like a true supercomputer in your living room, and on paper, the Cell processor looked like the future. It combined a central power PC core with 8 synergistic process element designs to handle heavy parallel workloads. But the worst feature wasn't just the complexity of Cell, it's how Sony split the PS3 memory. Instead of one unified pool, the system had 2 separate blocks, 256 megabytes of XDR DRAM for the CPU, and 256 megabytes of GDDR3 for the GPU. That gave developers only 512 megabytes total to work with, and because the pools were split, cross-access was possible, but limited and inefficient. Neither side could freely borrow the other's space without penalties. In practice, this design was a nightmare. Developers had to carefully plan every asset, deciding which memory pool it belonged in. And even then, the GPU could bottleneck with only 256 megabytes of dedicated space for high-resolution textures. Multi-platform games often ran worse on the PS3 compared to the Xbox 360 simply because of this limitation. While Sony's first-party studio eventually mastered the Cell, producing technical marvels like The Last of Us and Uncharted 2, the third-party developers struggled for years. What Sony envisioned as revolutionary architect ended up becoming a barrier to ports, a drag on performance, and one of the most infamous examples of over-engineering in console history. Kinect. When Microsoft unveiled the Xbox One, they pitched it less as a gaming machine and more as an all-in-one entertainment hub. At the heart of this vision was the Kinect. Every console came bundled with this motion-censored camera, and Microsoft insisted it was essential. The problem? Kinect drove the launch price up to $499, $100 higher than the PlayStation 4, and players immediately questioned why they were paying extra for something most didn't want. On paper, Kinect sounded futuristic. Voice commands, motion tracking, even the promise of controlling your entire living room. But in reality, the execution was clunky. Voice recognition often failed, gestures felt awkward, and the heavy emphasis on TV features like channel surfing and snap multitasking made the console feel bloated. Instead of delivering a gaming powerhouse, Microsoft presented an entertainment box that seemed embarrassed of its own games. Worse, the constant connection of Kinect raised privacy concerns, with critics questioning why a camera and microphone needed to always be on. Within a year, Microsoft backpedaled. They unbundled Kinect, dropped the price, and stripped out most of the TV features. But like we always say on this channel, by then, the damage was already done. The PS4 had surged ahead as the gaming console, while Xbox spent years trying to rebuild its image. Kinect meant to define the Xbox One. Instead, it became the anchor that nearly sank it. Gamepad. The Wii U's gamepad was supposed to be Nintendo's bold next step after the Wii Remote. A giant touchscreen controller with motion controls, NFC, and even a built-in camera. It looked like a futuristic Swiss Army knife for gaming, but in practice, it became the system's biggest liability. First, the design itself. A bulky plastic shell with a low-res 6.2 resistant touchscreen at just 854 by 480 resolution, it felt outdated compared to the HD TVs it was supposed to complement. And unlike the other touchscreens found on smartphones, this one required pressure or a stylus, making it clunkier than it should have been. Then there was the battery life. The original gamepad shipped with only a 1,500 milliamp battery, which translated to about 3 to 5 hours of playtime, sometimes less if brightness was maxed out. Nintendo eventually sold a larger battery that doubled life to around 8 hours, but it wasn't standard and required an extra purchase. Even worse, most games barely used the second screen in meaningful ways. Some offloaded maps or inventory to the controller, while others used it for gimmicks that quickly wore thin. Outside of a few standouts like Zombie U, the feature felt more like an obligation than an innovation. Instead of revolutionizing gameplay, the gamepad drained energy, confused marketing, and symbolized why the Wii U struggled to connect with players. What features do you think was the worst? Let me know in the comments below. Vita cards. Sony's PlayStation Vita was a handheld powerhouse, but it came shackled with one of the most infamous design choices in gaming: proprietary memory cards. Instead of using standard SD cards, Sony forced players to buy their custom-made Vita cards, and they were outrageously expensive. At launch, a 32GB could cost nearly $100, and even a smaller 4GB or 8GB card was priced far above normal market value. For a system that heavily promoted digital downloads through the PlayStation Store, this was a massive roadblock. The problem wasn't just price, it was a necessity. Many Vita games required these cards even if you bought the physical cartridge, because save data or patches couldn't fit on the game card itself. Players who thought they could skip the extra cost quickly discovered they couldn't even progress in certain games without buying one. This created an entry barrier that made the Vita less appealing right out the gate, especially when compared to the Nintendo 3DS, which supported much cheaper SD storage. Sony's reason was partly about security and controlling performance, but the decision backfired almost instantaneously. Gamers saw it as corporate greed at the expense of convenience. For a handheld already struggling against the rise of mobile gaming, these overpriced cards turned what could have been a beloved portable into one remembered most for wasted potential than innovation. UMD disc. When Sony launched the PSP, they wanted to deliver console-quality games on the go. Their answer was the Universal Media Disc, or UMD. A tiny optical disc sealed inside a plastic shell. On paper, it was clever. It held far more data than Nintendo's cartridges, letting developers cram in rich 3D graphics, full-motion videos, and even entire movies. But as a feature, UMDs came with problems that haunted the PSP for its entire life cycle. Load times were painfully slow. Some games took more than a minute just to boot, and frequent mid-game loading broke immersion. The mechanical drive also chewed through battery life compared to a solid-state cartridge. On top of that, the discs were fragile, and the plastic cases sometimes cracked or jammed inside the slot. The noise didn't help either. Players could literally hear their handheld grinding away during gameplay. Sony also tried to push UMD movies as a selling point, encouraging people to buy films specifically formatted for the disc, but the format never caught on, since people preferred DVDs and later digital downloads. By the end of the PSP life, many players preferred digital installs just to avoid the hassle. What was supposed to be Sony's big innovation edge instead became a symbol of wasted time, wasted battery, and wasted money. Joy-Con. The Nintendo Switch might be one of the most successful consoles ever, but its signature feature, the detachable Joy-Con controllers, also introduced one of its biggest headaches. Right from launch, players noticed drift, where the analog stick registered phantom inputs even when untouched. For something as core as movement, this flaw was impossible to ignore. Over time, dust, wear, and degradation of tiny potentiometers inside the sticks made drift nearly inevitable. And unlike a simple battery swap, fixing it required either expensive repairs or replacements. Nintendo eventually launched repair programs and even offered free fixes in regions like the US and Europe, but by then, the lawsuits had piled up and consumers' trust had already taken a hit. The problem was so widespread, it became a meme, with Joy-Con drift entering gaming vocabulary as shorthand for bad design. It's especially damaging because the Joy-Con, while innovative in concept, motion controls, HD rumble, and modular playstyles, was fragile in practice. The small size made it uncomfortable for many adult players, and the $80 price for a pair meant replacement were costly. Nintendo has since updated its hardware slightly, but drift hasn't disappeared entirely. For a company known for sturdy, long-lasting controllers, the Joy-Con ended up being a rare black mark, an iconic feature turned infamously flawed. Saturn CPU. The Sega Saturn's architecture is a perfect example of a feature that looked ambitious on paper but collapsed in practice. Instead of a single powerful processor, Sega stuffed the console with a tangled mess of chips. Most notoriously is dual Hideyoshi SH2 CPU running in parallel. While this design theoretically offered more raw power, it created endless headaches for developers. Both CPUs shared the same external bus, meaning they often fought each other for access to memory, causing bottlenecks instead of speed. And that was just the start. Alongside the dual CPU, the Saturn had two separate video processors, VDP1 and VDP2, that needed to be carefully coordinated for 3D graphics. It also packed multiple sound and code processors, each requiring their own programming quirks. The result was a system with incredible 2D sprite handling power, but one that made 3D development far harder than on Sony's PlayStation. Developers who wanted to port games often found the process so complex that they delivered inferior versions, or skipped the Saturn entirely. Even Sega's internal team struggled. And while some games like Virtua Fighter 2 and Panzer's Dragoon Saga show flashes of brilliance, most studios couldn't wrangle the hardware. What was meant to be Sega's cutting-edge design ended up being a developer's nightmare, and unfortunately, Saturn's library and sales ultimately paid the price. Jaguar Pad. The Atari Jaguar was marketed as the world's first 64-bit console, but its controller was anything but futuristic. The standard Jaguar Pad feature just had 3 face buttons, a D-pad, and a massive 12-button numeric keypad. Atari's idea was that developers could use plastic overlays to map game-specific functions onto the keypad, turning it into kinda a customizable control surface. In practice, though, it was clumsy, awkward, and universally disliked. The keypad made the controller unnecessarily bulky, and most games didn't use the overlay in a meaningful way. Some titles just shoved basic functions like pause or map onto the number pad, forcing players to fumble during gameplay. Others ignored it entirely, leaving players with a controller that felt half empty. To make matters worse, the Jaguar face button layouts was limited compared to the 6-button Sega Genesis controller or even the 4-button Super Nintendo pad, making it feel outdated despite being marketed as next gen. Instead of giving players precision and innovation, the Jaguar pad became a symbol of everything wrong with the console. Overcomplicated design with little payoff. Even when Atari tried to fix it later with the Pro controller, adding more face buttons, the damage was done. The Jaguar controller was remembered not for creativity, but for being one of the most uncomfortable and confusing pads ever shipped. Wii friend codes. While Xbox Live and PlayStation Network let players connect with simple usernames, Nintendo's charted its own course with its most infamous feature, friend codes. Introduced on Nintendo DS and carried over to the Wii, there was a 12-digit code that each player had to exchange in order to connect. Instead of sending a quick friend request, you had to manually swap numbers, and both sides had to enter them before the connection worked. The system was meant to protect younger audiences by adding an extra layer of privacy, but it came at the cost of usability. Typing codes on a DS or Wii was clunky, and manageable multiple friends meant juggling scraps of paper or a digital list just to keep track. Worse, every game often had its own friend code, so even if you already added someone in one title, you might need to repeat the process in another. Gamers quickly grew frustrated, especially as online play became a standard feature across consoles. It made Nintendo's system feel years behind their competitors, and many players simply gave up on online connectivity altogether. While Nintendo has since modernized things with the Switch, the memory of friend codes remain a reminder of how overprotective design can turn a feature into a burden. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button to subscribe for more video game explainer videos, and let us know what type of videos you would like to see next.